Welcome back, guys. Deuce Douglas here, and today we're going to be looking at one of my favorite additions to Madden 20 and something that I've been wanting to see return since Madden 12, which is the fog of war elements that affect dev traits. And this video is going to take a look at some ways that I think it could be expanded upon and made even better moving forward. And I realize that Madden 20 isn't even out yet, and I'm here already talking about what needs to happen moving forward, but that's kind of the nature of the beast with franchise mode, and I feel like something that I haven't done well, especially this past year, has been putting stuff out there early enough. So with something like this and scenarios, which are things that I really want to see built on moving forward, I wanted to get something out there to show you guys where I'd like to see it go, as well as create a discussion around what kind of things you guys would like to see, as well as where you'd like to see it go moving forward as well. And the reason why I'm hitting on this first is because, like I said, this is one of my favorite additions to Madden 20, and with how much demand for more of it and how universally appreciated I've seen it be since it was announced, it seems like something the community really likes as well. I haven't really seen anybody be against it, but the one thing that I have seen is a lot of frustration over it only encompassing the Superstar and Superstar X Factor dev traits, with the thought process there being that it's pointless to have something like Fog of War if the game is still going to essentially tell you that you have something good. But in reality, that was pretty much exactly how it was intended. They still wanted users to have that instant gratification of knowing you have something good without necessarily knowing whether it was good or great. And while I understand that point and definitely think it's something that needs to be considered, I actually think hiding all of the dev traits is something that would amplify that gratification, but then along with that, it also provides far more chances for disappointment as well, and that's something I'll get into more as we go along, but I want to get into some of the ways that Fog of War could be taken further when it comes to dev traits. So to start here, we're going to begin with the most basic approach when it comes to expanding things, and that's going to be simply making all dev traits for rookies hidden rather than just Superstar and Superstar X Factor players. So every rookie that you draft, every rookie that's a free agent after the draft is going to have a hidden dev trait. And what this would do is obviously provide a lot more mystery behind what kind of player you have, and whether they're a first rounder or a seventh rounder, you're going to have to put in the time to figure out what you have, which I think is one of the big positives of taking this approach. It would help elevate the preseason and make it a tad more meaningful and worth playing, because you'd want to be conscious of getting those players snaps toward unlocking their dev trait, and it would really provide a sense of progressing through a season as you'd be unlocking multiple players at different times over the course of that season. And then, like I just mentioned, I think it actually enhances that gratification feeling when it comes to players that have higher dev traits because of the wider range of possibilities. It makes revealing a Superstar or Superstar X Factor more of a surprise rather than something that is expected, but that is also a gift and a curse in itself, because the chances of revealing a lower dev trait is also going to be higher as well. But to hit on that, I think it also gives you the chance to become attached to players that you might otherwise have immediately given up on after finding out as soon as you draft them that they only have normal dev. Now, the downsides to this approach is that it's essentially being blind for the sake of being blind. It's not really a Fog of War mechanic, because whether a guy goes number one overall or is Mr. Irrelevant, they're both going to be treated the same way, and until they put in the snaps, you're not going to know what you have. And while you can reasonably assume that a player taken higher is going to have a better chance of having a higher dev, that's not something that would really be conveyed. And while I would be completely fine with that, I don't necessarily think that it's as realistic or as interesting as it could be, nor as user-friendly, which, like I said, is always something that has to be considered. So from there's a couple of different approaches that can be taken, starting with a straight-up perceived potential approach. And basically, this would appear similar to what you're used to seeing, with the exception that the dev trait shown would actually be perceived rather than exact, meaning that it might be what's shown, or it could potentially be a tier higher or a tier lower. So for a Superstar dev, his perceived potential could show as a star, Superstar, or Superstar X Factor. If it says he's a star, then he could be anything from normal to star to Superstar, while if it said he was a Superstar X Factor, then that player could either be Superstar or the Superstar X Factor that was shown. And with this method, you'd be able to keep some of that instant gratification when you got something good, and you'd also get a more true Fog of War effect that would give you a less precise picture of the player while still hinting at what he could be, because you'd know the potential range for what the dev could be. If you draft a player and it says normal, you'll know the best case scenario for that player is that he's a star dev. If you draft a player and it says Superstar X Factor, you know the worst case scenario is that he's a Superstar dev with abilities. And then for everybody in between that, it creates a bit wider gap where you might draft a player that says he's a star, and he could end up either potentially having Superstar abilities, he could end up with that star dev it says he has, or he could end up as a normal dev bust. And that kind of intrigue and uncertainty is a dynamic that I think would really really add a lot to the franchise experience. And with this, I think you really do get the best of both worlds. For the casual player or the newcomer to franchise mode, they're not left completely in the dark as to what kind of player they drafted. And then for someone like me that wants that added depth and uncertainty, it's going to affect every rookie you draft and every rookie you sign as an undrafted free agent. So each season you're going to have a number of players that you're not 100% sure about, which in turn creates more interesting and thoughtful roster decisions because you're faced with maybe going with a more known commodity or gambling on the chance that the player's perceived dev is actually higher than what it says it is. So that's a bit more definable approach to Fog of War, in that whatever the player's perceived dev was, you'd know for sure that his actual dev was going to be the same or at most one higher or one lower. But with this next approach, it's very similar but a bit more broad and has a bit more possibilities because of that, and it's going to be using a dev ceiling and a dev floor type system. So when you drafted a player, rather than seeing his exact dev or a perceived dev or a hidden dev, you'd be given his dev ceiling, which is the highest his dev could be, as well as his dev floor, which is the lowest it could possibly be. So this is going to be very similar to the previous example, but with a much wider range of possibilities. With the previous example, the range could only be 2 or 3 dev traits, but here you could potentially see a player with a ceiling of superstar X Factor and a floor of normal. And then on the flip side of that, maybe you draft a player with a ceiling of superstar X Factor, but his floor is only superstar, or a ceiling of star and a floor of normal. So there'd be potentially a range of 2, 3, or even 4 dev traits that players could end up being, and that's going to create different levels of that Fog of War effect. And this is probably my favorite and most preferred approach because I think those increased possibilities create a more realistic experience. Going back to the example of a player having a ceiling of superstar X Factor and a floor of normal, that could emulate on the successful side a player like Patrick Mahomes, where there were a ton of questions coming out about how good he'd actually be. And then on the opposite side of that, a player like Jake Locker, who, quote, had all the tools but never really put it together or really had it in the first place. And then for someone like a Khalil Mack, a Von Miller, or an Andrew Luck, or players that are more consensus locks to be good players, you'd have situations where they'd also have that superstar X Factor ceiling, but only with a floor of superstar. Then on the flip side of that, for lower picks and undrafted free agents, you'd see a lot more situations where their ceiling was only star and their floor was normal. So like I said, a lot more potential here, and again, I think you get the best of both worlds. The average user isn't in most cases going to be completely blind to what they drafted. They will have an idea, which in some cases will be more vague and random than others, but no matter what, they're not completely blind, and expectations are set immediately on what a player is or could be, so they don't use them for 10 games just to be disappointed by a normal dev that they didn't see coming. And then for those that do want that depth, you get varying levels of Fog of War with multiple possibilities and dynamics, which is going to keep things interesting for a longer period of time. But moving on, and lastly here is going to be a bit more outside of the box approach that would again take into account a player having the possibility of having every dev trait. And how I mock that up is basically being done as showing a percentage of the likelihood that the player is a certain dev trait. So here you see Nick Bosa of the 49ers, and it says he has a 30% chance of being superstar X Factor, 40% chance of being superstar, 20% chance of being a star, and 10% of being normal. So from this, you can easily gather that the chances of him being a normal dev are very slim, but still possible, and that most likely he's either going to be a superstar X Factor or a superstar dev trait. And mechanically, you could approach this a couple of different ways as well. One being the current way, where a player has a predetermined dev trait and the percentages would just act as that layer of obscurity so that you didn't know exactly what the player was, but also weren't completely blind to the possibilities and what kind of player you were dealing with. And then the secondary approach could be to make it so that every rookie comes out of the draft with the same requirements when it came to progression, meaning they all earn XP at the same rate and require the same amount of XP to earn skill points until they reach that snap requirement. And then from there, the game would use whatever that player's percentages were to essentially dice roll and determine that player's dev trait moving forward. And to me, that second approach makes more sense there, but probably involves a bit too much RNG for most people's taste, and would also require altering the structure of things when it came to progression, and just overall is a bit more messy of a mechanic in my opinion. But ultimately, it would definitely achieve the goal of having more of that Fog of War feel, where you would truly have no idea what a player was going to be until that snap requirement was met. But like I said, it's a more outside the box approach, and one that I'm not exactly sure most people would enjoy, but I included it nonetheless. But I think that just about covers everything. Let me know what you guys thought of these ideas, which one was your favorite, which ones you didn't like, and if one of them is how you'd like to see dev traits handled handled within franchise mode. Also, if there's any other ideas you guys have for how Fog of War could be applied to dev traits, throw them down in the comments. I'm going to have another video soon about how this could be applied to player ratings as well, so be on the lookout for that. As always, I appreciate you guys tuning in to listen to me talk about my Madden ideas, and until next time, thanks for watching.